Okay. Well, again, thank you for taking the time to chat with me. I I know about you. I think we have, mutual friends.
We do.
But Sally suggested that I chat with you, and I was like, oh, yes. She's like famous. So why don't we start with first your name, who you are, and a little bit of your background.
Hey, Inga Nicole Laurent. I like to put the N in there a lot. My mom wanted to name me Nicole. So it really is an honor of her. And I just like the way it sounds. Like,
That's my best friend's name.
really?
Mhm.
Love that. Yeah. So I like to use the N a lot just because it reminds me of her.
Mhm.
So that's the background for why I use Inga N all the time. Yeah, so okay, so that's my name. Who am I? Where I come from? Born in Brooklyn,
Okay,
uh,
okay.
Brooklyn, New York, and lived there for 11 years, about 11 years of my life. So that shapes a lot of who I am because I grew up with like really diverse neighborhoods, lots of good food in a very close radius. I grew up on the ocean. Nobody ever thinks about that when they think about New York, but the the
It's
ocean
right
was a
there.
mile down the street. Yeah, so I grew up oftentimes over the summer at the beach, even though it might be the dirtiest beach in the world. I don't know.
Yeah.
Definitely the country, but still it was a beach with an ocean. And then we moved to Ohio, where my mother's family was from a small town. So it was a very paradoxical experience, right? Ohio, this tiny town from a big city to a small town. Um, and yeah, and that's where I stayed through high school before I left for college. So really like sort of half in one place and half in another place. And that ultimately sort of shapes my story, I think, because I usually find middle a very comfortable place. And that's often because I feel like so much of my life has been at extremes on either end. So typically, so someplace like Spokane is really quite wonderful for me. Before Spokane, I was in Cleveland, and that was also a really good city for me. Mid-sized sort of cities that have a community feel, but also have lots to do, enough to get you in trouble. Right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so that's background. Yeah,
How long
that's
have you
where I
been
grew
in
up.
Spokane?
Hmm?
How long have you been in Spokane?
I've been here since 2010.
Okay.
It's significant. I'm almost to the point where I think I could call myself a Spokenite.
Right. Yeah. I've been here about a decade.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, it kind of feels like, yeah, it's weird. It's not home, but like I've been here, for a while.
For a while. Yeah.
Yeah. So what brought you to, did you go to college here?
Mm-mm.
Okay.
No. So I went to school in Northwest Pennsylvania in Cleveland. That's where I did most of my education back in the Midwest. And then I came here for a job at Gonzaga. So
Okay.
I started, this is my 14th academic year. I'm starting my 14th academic year with Gonzaga. I came here to direct their externship program, which is basically like putting law students
Mm.
in the fields. And it's a great job for me because like you get to interface with a lot of constituents. So I got to talk to judges and lawyers, and I got to help transition students into more practice ready professionals, which I think is super important. And I didn't really have in law school. So I went straight from like
Mm.
undergrad to law school right into practice. And that was a rude awakening. And I wasn't reflective about who I was going to be as a professional and how I was going to show up. And so the externship program I really loved being a part of because it was a training that I wish I had had, and the reflection and sort of the self awareness. I wanted to foster that for students so that they could have easier transitions into practice, so that they could have at least thought about how they're going to show up in the world when all of a sudden you have these very real responsibilities of clients' lives and their well being in your hands. We're not doctors, but we really do deal with people's, mental health and wellness and well-being. Because often when you're in a dispute, right, it can be almost all encompassing, and it can be about some of the most important issues in people's lives, like their families, for
Yeah,
example.
and it takes a lot of time, energy, capacity, which a lot of people don't have a whole lot of, and there are very real impacts to all of that. So what a great way to like address the whole person, as they're like trying to navigate all these really difficult things. How long did you do that for? And also like congrats for being at Gonzaga for 2 years.
Thanks. Yeah, I did that for about 10 years.
Oh
So
wow.
from 2010 to about 2020. And I really liked it, would still be doing it, honestly, if I didn't make this transition into more what we call stand-up or doctrinal classes, which I'm teaching in the more like core curriculum. But I really like the work that I did in that space with externships, because I agree exactly with you. It's about bringing and integrating your whole self into any work that you do, and that was really good space for me.
Yeah, so now you're also teaching at Gonzaga. Okay.
Hmm.
Yeah, I know very, very little about what you're teaching. I did want to ask, because your focus is restorative justice. Can you share what that is about for people that, aren't familiar with the term, and then what what caused you to kind of switch to make that focus?
So back up just a little. So I teach, actually, restorative justice is just a sliver of what I get to teach, which is
Okay.
kind of sad for me, because I would teach about it all day long if I could, and it'd be the only thing I would focus on. But we have other core curricular needs. And so I teach criminal in the criminal arena. So I teach criminal law, which is all about like the substantive law. Like, what is the definition of an offense? Like, how do you know if you've committed burglary or manslaughter? So that's criminal law. I also teach criminal procedure, which is like all about the Fourth Amendment, search and seizure, all of the investigative steps up to trial. I teach evidence, which is all about, hearsay objections and things of that matter, and character evidence. And I also get to occasionally teach restorative justice, which is really where my heart is. But as a professor, you get to research in any area you want. So all of my research is directed at not just restorative justice, but I'll kind of define a few things. Uh, Transitional justice, restorative justice, and transformative justice are kind of my wheelhouse. But it started all with restorative justice, so I can start there.
Yeah, that would be great because I mean, yeah, I don't know a whole lot about it. I think it's being talked about a lot more, but I think it's still a new concept for a lot of people.
Yeah. So to start with, I should always acknowledge the roots of restorative justice, come from Indigenous folks, people who have lived for since time immemorial, finding ways to relate to one another and to keep people in community together. Like, that's its core roots. And so the sort of the sticking points with restorative justice today is when you have a paradigm that works with people who are purposely trying to foster community and stay in relationship with one another, it works very well. But what do you do in societies where we're more disconnected from each other, where we have more individualized notions of how we exist in the world? So that translation is really like the kind of the rub of restorative justice, like how you actually make it stick and how you make it work is where we're seeing most of the problems that arise in restorative justice. But the general idea is, when you commit a harm or a wrongdoing, you cause a rift in relationship. And that could be like an actual relationship, like you have a relationship, or more like a societal relationship, right? That we're in relation to one another because we live in the same community together. Uh, and so the idea of restorative justice saw a resurgence in about the 70s because how we resolved for these wrongdoings was through the criminal legal system, right? Somebody did something wrong or committed a crime, and the state would come in and take care of it all for everybody. And what we noticed in that process, right, was that a lot of people were either abdicating and giving away their responsibility to sort of be engaged in the process, or they were sort of being pushed to the side, right? A lot of times, folks who have been on the receiving end of crime, who are, we could say, a survivor victim, even though they are the primary person, right, that was impacted, it's state v whoever, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
the state actually comes in and takes over the primary role. And so that's where all the resources are dedicated. That's where all the intentionality and the information is dedicated. And so we think that restorative justice practitioners think that creates a disincentive to being involved and to meaningful accountability. Um, because if the person who caused the harm is actually incentivized to stay silent, for example, one of their, the Fifth Amendment right, you have the right not to, not to self-incriminate, then you create any disincentive for a person who's caused harm to take stock of what they've done, to think about ways to make it better, to think about why they did it and how if situations don't change, they would probably just do it again. And so the idea is to get people to restorative justice, in short, is to get people to closer to the offenses and the harms that are committed, and get people to engage in that explanation of understanding what happened and why it happened, and is it going to happen again? And here's what happened and to explain the impacts
Mm.
of when somebody caused you harm, because that kind of accountability feels like real accountability, right? That to have to sit and look somebody in the eyes as they tell you what the impacts of the harm that you caused to them are, and then to stay in that conversation, to stay in that discomfort, and then to reveal what was going on for you and why you did it, and who you are as a whole person, and what conditions made you sort of the way you are, not to excuse your behavior, but to have a fuller picture of why I did what I did. And then to stay in that conversation and try and figure out how you can repair is, I think, the most meaningful form of accountability that there is.
So yeah, that seems like a really, I mean, harsh, uncomfortable examination of like yourself, what you've done, and a lot of introspection. Like, how would you prepare someone for that?
So, and we're kind of talking about like the very sort of brass tacks practical approach. I want to like back up too by saying, like, it's not for everybody. It's not a panacea. It doesn't, right? It doesn't
Right.
solve all problems. Uh, it's for a set of folks where the conditions are right. It might be, I mean, restorative justice happens for people at all different stages. It can happen for people before the criminal system even kicks in. It can happen in schools, and we can do what we call tier 1, 2, and 3. Tier 1 is just relationship building in circle and having a dialogic process where we get to know one another and get used to using I statements and how we feel and explaining who we are as an individual and dialoguing with each other. Um, so it can just happen in so many different ways. Like, you can have restorative justice can be operational when we've seen cases on the other end of the extreme, cases where people have lost their lives, right? There was a murder that was committed, and somebody in a prison system who's already being punished, right? They're incarcerated. They're probably not going to be released. but they've had the space and time to evaluate what they've done. And now the victim and the victim survivor, their families want answers that nobody can provide except for the person who caused the harm. And so you see things happen on that end of the spectrum, where somebody is ready for that information. They've done their sort of, maybe they're not healed. We don't like to use sort of those like conclusory words. They've done a lot of their healing, and they're in space where they're ready to receive information, and they want that information, right? And on the other end, you have an offender who has sat with themselves enough to be able and ready to enter that conversation in a way that won't be damaging. And so, like, there's a whole range, but the key is who facilitates it. And good facilitators essentially creating a lot of space for assessment of the different parties who want to use restorative justice, assessment of the capacity for parties to use restorative justice, assessment of for where people are at sort of with regards to their mental health and their counseling about the incident. How serious is the incident? How long ago was it? How much healing has been done? What needs currently are not met that would need to be met before you try and put two folks together into this conversation? Describing the process and all of the range of possibilities that could result from this process, putting somebody through almost like a scenario where they're going to be sort of like ready for that conversation. What's it going to feel like if this happens? Making sure people think about just the full range of why they're doing it and what they hope to get out of it, and what the process is going to be like. And good facilitators will do that. And it can take a few weeks, it can take months, it can take years, right?
Yeah.
Mhm.
So I I'm don't have TikTok, but I know there's trends about like, oh, what are red flags? What are green flags? What are some, in as I think from the facilitator perspective, what are some red flags that someone might watch out for, like to say maybe you're not ready to go through this process?
Yeah. Also, I should say one other thing is I've been leaving out all the sort of the linchpin of this too is community, because community can also be engaged with us. It doesn't just have to be the person who caused harm, right, and the person who was harmed. It can be their supports, both of their supports, right, and who's willing to enter into this space additionally to support this conversation and healing for everyone. So I just want to make sure I put that in there. But green flags and red flags. Well, we'll do red flags because they're more fun. um, or they're more salient. Maybe not fun is not the right word, but they're more like
Interesting.
Interesting. Exactly. That's
Yes.
where people want to go. Like,
Yeah.
right?
Like,
I'm
ooh,
a
I want to
green flag
know.
person. I love hearing about green flags, but yeah, people are like, but give me what can go wrong. Like, so, and it depends on whose perspective we're talking about, but let's say we're talking about from a person who's caused harm. A person who is disassociating from that harm in any way is not able to enter into this conversation. And frankly, our criminal legal system is designed, we incarcerate people and put them into scenarios where the likely outcome is disassociation. They did something, it's not about me and what I did, because there's no space to like have that conversation with yourself, right? Everything is like about external and blame and their fault. And or, you know, I wouldn't have to do that if, right? Instead of taking responsibility for the action. So that's the first red flag. You cannot enter into space and reharm someone if the person who caused harm is not ready to sit in an uncomfortable position and hear what they've done and take responsibility for what they've done. So other things, okay, red flag, green flag. So what you would look for conversely is somebody who is being transparent and honest with themselves, and who doesn't only denigrate themselves, right? I did something, I'm so bad, but who recognizes the fullness of their reality. I really screwed up in that situation. And it's because these things have happened to me in my past, and it shaped how I viewed the situation. But I shouldn't have taken that step. And I'm sorry that I did that. Right. So somebody who can work with the nuances of what it is to be human, right? Recognizing their good qualities, their bad qualities. And that's who can enter into a conversation, because then we can have a real conversation, right, about what happened, why it happened, and what needs to happen going forward so that it doesn't happen again. So that would be like a green flag, a red flag and a green flag. On the side of the person who was harmed, this is interesting because it's okay to be angry, right? It's not saying that we're not looking for we want people who are in touch with their emotions, right? But if the purpose is to denigrate somebody else's existence, to only, right, get in that space because you just want to hurt somebody else, then we're just perpetuating cycles of harm, right? Because it's in that space, somebody hurt you and you're hurting. You're wanting to hurt back, and that's not productive or generative space. There's a difference between owning and feeling angry about what happened to you, and right, sort of being in space where you want to harm or where you want to punish, right? And so that's what we would be looking for, kind of on either end. That's just a really, sort of simple one line of red flag, green flag, but those are the types of things that facilitators should be looking for. And, surprisingly, many facilitators are people who have been through processes themselves and who found it helpful to them. And so those are really some of the best folks to facilitate, right? Because they have been in the shoes. And so they are aware of kind of like what characteristics they should be looking for.
Yeah. And I imagine kind of fluctuating between being okay, well, not being okay, but like understanding that you're angry and wanting to maybe cause harm or punish them. I mean, you could go in between those two, and you could feel both depending on the day, or like maybe like you're angry but you don't want to punish. I feel like that is a really hard place to be with for like so many people.
Yeah. And I think that's real, right? And that's why restorative justice is so scary to some people, because it's so fungible. It moves so much. And on the flip side, that's why it's so effective, because it's individually tailored to meet people exactly sort of where they're at. And so, yeah, the question I would really like, and then so moving through a process with somebody who's in that space would be, well, what are you going to say? What's it going to feel like when that person walks into the room? What if they say this? And like essentially just sort of like being in that space with them and having them anticipate and think about their desires, their wants, their needs, what's not been met. So many times too, you find what happens is people who have been harmed are frozen often in that moment of harm, right? And because of that, all these other needs that they have aren't being assessed. They're not being met. There's not the space to meet those other needs, which means they're operating from a place of deficit. And a lot of times community members are well-intentioned, but are re-inflaming that harm. Instead of sitting down and saying, what do you need? Tell me what I can do. How are you feeling? What scares you now? Where our response is often, don't worry, they'll get what they had coming to them. don't worry, it'll work out the way it's supposed to work out, right? Like we unintentionally often do a lot of harm as people who are supportive because we're afraid to sit in discomfort as supporters. And so oftentimes what you find is people who have been harmed are in a world of trouble because our legal system, our support systems, our social support systems do not know how to adequately sit with pain and discomfort and to really help somebody in the ways that recognizes their autonomy and how they want to be helped. And that is like a very, I think that's why we all have something to learn from restorative justice, because at its core, it's really about like all of us trying to get to better versions of ourselves by respecting people's dignity and autonomy in a meaningful way.
Yeah, I think I just had a thought and it flew out of my head. I think it's probably human nature to want to fix things, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh, don't worry, like karma will get him, it'll all work itself out, you want to like be the healer and like you're right, just say, oh, it's okay, instead of like, oh, that really sucks, and feeling helpless. Like no one wants to feel helpless
Mm-hmm.
in if they're seeing like a friend or a family member suffering. And when you were explaining all of that, I just kept thinking about um, the approach like the Y has when it comes to domestic violence survivors, in that, yes, they're going through so much. They're in this like trauma brain. They can't think about anything else. And even if you were 100% confident in saying like, don't worry, it's going to be okay, that won't mean anything. And so it's not even about fixing anything at first. It's like, here's some water, here's some food. Why don't you just sit down?
Yes, needs based.
Yes.
Yeah, yes,
Because like, how can you do
yes.
something so complicated like navigate our legal system and do all this like paperwork and re-traumatize yourself in doing the paperwork if like you can't even calm your brain down? Yeah, I totally like resonate with that. And like um I think there is a difference, but I think people confuse being relatable with being empathetic. And I try not to, like, people are just trying to be nice, but they say like, "Oh yeah, that's happened to me too." And I'm like, "That's not what I'm trying to tell you or connect with you. Like I'm trying to tell you like something is hard for me." And it's great that you feel like you've gone through the same thing, but it's not going to be exactly the same thing.
Mhm. Yeah. And I think like, so I didn't tell you this part, but the start of my career was working with AVAWA grants and providing civil legal services for victims of domestic violence. And that was, I credit that with who I am today in the world, because I had many of the things that I'm able to say now, and many of this, like much of the reflection I have done came from not being a great advocate in the beginning, because of coming from that perspective of wanting to fix for somebody rather than walking along somebody while they tell me what pieces of the puzzle I have and can assist with. Um, having these questions about why people chose the actions that they did without recognizing the web of the reality that we all live in and the conditions that we live in, which, uh, you know, I had a lot of learning to do. And so I it just makes me feel really good that I'm now coming full circle and and like, yes, I'm finally in alignment with the practices of where I wanted to be when I started practicing.
Yeah, that I mean that makes me really happy too.
Mhm.
Just because it is such a complex, it's a complex situation, no matter what kind of DV situation you're in. It is complex. Um, it is not black and white, and people think it is. But I have also learned a lot being here in the complexities, and a lot of people don't want to press charges. They just want it to like go away or whatever, like,
Mhm.
just to help that trauma brain, like they just don't want to deal with it. Like, how can I get back to my
Mhm.
daily life,
Or
because
what are
this
the
has.
consequences if I do press charge? I mean,
Yeah.
that starts a whole path of consequences. And people who are survivors are really, really ingenious. They're calculating those consequences at a very far level down the road. It's we don't give it enough credit, but it's an academic exercise, right? That
Hmm.
their academic is lived experience, their academic experience is lived experience, but that's what they're doing. They're logically sort of charting out all the possibilities, and seeing that our systems aren't really designed to deal with those consequences in a meaningful way. It can't be responsive to individualized situations, and
Yeah.
they recognize that. And that is really smart, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I know that you teach all the things about criminal justice. When did you start incorporating, this restorative justice into your curriculum?
Yeah, I think, what led me down the path was, I think, even through, I've always been doing this, but in different names. So when I was doing it with the externship program, right, it was whole person centered, right? It was the autonomy to be a whole person in a new work experience, right? And so I think I've like just sort of always come back to this core thread. I've just sort of given it different names at times. And that's how I wound up like really, really falling in deep with restorative justice principles, because so much of it is about respecting the dignity and worth of all individuals, including individuals who have caused harm, which is sometimes the hardest one for us to wrap our brains around because we want to put them in a box, and a literal box. Um, right? And what does that look like? And it's just such hard questions, and that's why I love doing what I do. um I get a platform to ask critical and hard questions. When I left practice very quickly, right after about 3.5 years, realizing I wasn't equipped and didn't have the tools to see the results that I wanted for my clients, I fell into a profession that allows me. Scholarship is all about asking hard critical questions about things that aren't working and things that could be better, right? And so I think it was natural for me to find this space. I didn't know it, and like I can look at it in hindsight and see a path, but it to me it felt like, oh, I'm doing this now, I'm doing this no. So yeah, and I think you can't ask questions about our criminal legal system without questioning the premise that it's effective. Um, we are not seeing the results that we say it's designed to produce. And that's scary to me, because that means we're out of alignment with what we think our goals should be. And whenever I do anything, I want it to be based in reality. I don't want it to be based in, uh, you know, we say the goal is to put people, okay, so it's deterrence. Well, people aren't being deterred, right? If that's not the goal, I mean, I think the goal, if we're being very, very honest, is we want to harm people because they've harmed people. And so we want to show them that harming people is wrong by harming them.
Mhm.
I think at its core, that is retributive, right? That's the sort of notion of justice that we have. But we know the way that we think about how we educate young people, right? Like, it's through showing a new possibility. It's for giving somebody internal worth and desire not to put themselves in those situations, to make different choices. But what choice do you give folks if you put them into systems that literally strip them of their agency to make choices? That is not going to produce, and for 95% of people who will be released, that exacerbates the problem. It doesn't go to the root cause. And that's really scary to me. And so that's why I started looking at, well, what do alternatives or parallel systems look like? Or how have people done justice for most of human history? Like, what else exists as a possibility? Not because I want to condemn something for being wrong, but because when you care about something, you want it to be better. You want to improve it, right? I love America. And because I love America, I'm critical of America because I want it to be better. I want it to live in alignment with its principles that it professes. To me, that's love. So,
That's really beautiful and so accurate, like, yes, things can be better. Like we've seen it in different examples. And yeah, I think seeing the potential of something and having to, even though you're working towards it, like being a little bit powerless in how to get there, or how to reach that potential, is often frustrating. As you were, kind of describing that cycle of people wanting to harm the person who's harmed them, like one question that came into my head was like, because yes, that's we're taught, we see and learn by doing. So we see those examples all the time. One question that I had was like, how do you show someone that they've done something wrong if they can't go through that same pain that you went through? Like, how else do you show them, like, you hurt me, I
mhm,
want you to feel that,
mhm,
so that the extent. But if that in the long term really doesn't help anyone, like, how else do
mhm.
you get them to make that connection?
That's such a good question because I've never actually thought about it in those ways. And I think it's interesting because it's like causing me to help like reframe how I sort of like think about this, because I think it's maybe coming from a different place, in that, like, I'm not saying this with my intention being to harm you, but my intention is to stand very firmly on my ground and tell you my truth and my reality and how you created the conditions for this harm, right? And maybe a byproduct of that, right, is somebody feels,
Hmm.
right? They feel bad about that. But I think it's that, and maybe that goes back to your original question about how I know somebody's ready to engage in restorative justice, right? I'm not doing this because, like, everything is aimed at revenge, right? I'm doing this because I know my worth, and my worth lies in ventilating, telling about what you caused for me. And part of my healing journey is understanding and speaking my truth about how the harm has impacted my life in negative ways. And because I am a strong person, in the ways that it's not just a tragic story. I'm resilient and I found this road as well, right? And so it's telling a story in its fullness, and it's because I have the right to tell it because it's mine, versus I'm doing this because I want to tell you how crappy of a person you are. Right. And so it comes from a different place, I think. So I think there's difference about like wanting to hurt someone as opposed to um, wanting to engage in the process um, of putting my story out there for you to hear.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I really appreciate your question because like I could see how those they're like right next to each other, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I think about, people in those situations and how, um, some people say an eye for an eye because that is the most fair way
Mhm.
to, I don't know, punish someone or to show them what the consequences are. Um, so when you try to remove further perpetuating, harm, what are the other ways that we can move forward?
The problem with that approach too, right, for us is that it also freezes an individual at the worst thing that they did and that the harm that they committed. It doesn't recognize that because most people who cause harm are people who have been harmed, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
it only shows you a sliver, right, of the person, and it doesn't like contextualize their reality. So they never get to be a victim. They never get to be someone who did harm because they're frozen in this moment of the harm that they've caused to other people. I mean, you could think about it like from the evolution of, let's say we have somebody who's the victim, a survivor of a crime, and then they, as a means of coping, go out and harm other people, right? Like that's not excusable. We're not saying it's excusable for the person who caused harm here either, right? Um but understanding what happened, right, to create those conditions for them
Mm-hmm.
to be able to go out and do that is a super important part of the story, because if you don't have that whole picture, um you know, like it's very hard to want to have the will to change if somebody is inflicting a punishment on you versus somebody listening to your whole story, identifying and seeing you in your fullness, and then saying, how do we change that behavior? Right? Like I think one's one's more likely to produce a result. Or a positive result, I guess I would say, a productive result.
Mm-hmm.
Because also you just see what happens, like the anger and the entrenchment and those bad skills that were learned just go deeper. And that's not what I want at all. In fact, that really scares me. And that's what we're doing mostly in systems of incarceration. And that to me is really, really scary.
Mm-hmm.
And you're producing a pool of folks who don't have adequate resources, who live in scarcity mentality, and you're putting them together. And there's a whole bunch of disassociating going on, people not taking responsibility for what they're doing, and they don't have any agency to learn how to make new decisions and to learn not to be impulsive and to learn new pathways of being that create new possibilities. And it's so scary to me. And that's why I think like it's really important to investigate and be very real about why we do what we do right now and be very honest with ourselves about it. And also say like, well, what's the goal? What are the results? And is it working? And in my view, the answer is no.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I a question that I come back to a lot in the different parts of my work are, when you learn something new or learn what you're doing is not great, how do you take that and what do you do with that information? I think whatever you do with, that, it says a lot about a person.
And I just think about how many times I've tried to learn a new skill or change behavior in myself. It's taken umpteen trials. It's
Mhm.
taken examples. It's taken watching somebody who I can now aspire to show me a different kind of way of being in the world. It takes a lot of work, and to just expect people to make that transformation in, frankly, a hellish environment is really, like, it's not a very linear or logical thought.
Yeah, another example that I think about is that same expectation when people are in like or like using, different substances.
Mhm,
And then they go through, a
mhm.
rehabilitation center. They're given X amount of days to make such a huge life change without like being able to practice it, and like how unfair that is because you're so right. For like simple habits and like changing things can take so many attempts and years and years and years. And like you can just mentally preparing, just thinking about it can also take years.
And think about our other players in the whole scenario, right? Think about community members who maybe saw, oh, we saw that coming, but we didn't do anything about it, right? What role did they play? What societal role do we sort of say, oh, that's okay behavior, that's not okay behavior? We're going to intervene here, we're not going to intervene here. And also there's the role of the state, right? In terms of saying like, oh, if you see something, say something, but don't intervene, right?
Right.
So there we have that to contend with too. But and also, like you said earlier, survivor victimhood is complex, right? What about the ways I contributed? I might contribute, right, to behaviors that need to shift. And that's a hard one, right? Because everybody's like, "Whoa, don't," it's a victim blaming, right? Like, and that has been done, and it's been harmful, and it's not right.
Mhm.
And there's this larger space, right, where we none of us are perfectly good or perfectly bad. And we all have complex dynamics at work, and we all have things that we can work on and ways that we can learn to establish our own boundaries better, right? There are things that I need to learn, right? That a don't necessarily put me in space to say I contributed to the harm that was caused, but B, right, like, do you contribute to how I'm going to form healthy relationships going forward and what I will take and what I won't take, and learning those boundaries and that self-worth that, enables me to avoid, um, you know, situations to the extent that they are avoidable. So it's complex.
Yes. Yeah. Life is hard. Life is very
Yes.
hard.
Oh God, it is so hard.
Well, this hour has really flown by, and I feel like we could continue to talk about this forever. I enjoy learning and like really digging into things, and just learning from people that are like way smarter than me. What one last question? What keeps you doing the work that you do, and how do you take care of yourself in doing this work?
I think this, like having a real conversation with someone, letting someone into my head, and in exchange them letting me into theirs, like, is a really beautiful thing. Um and I love when people are just real. Like you said, it's hard. It's hard to human. And like that kind of stuff, I know it seems counterintuitive because everybody like wants to paint it like it's okay, we're okay, I'm fine. Right. But like to me, the most rewarding stuff is the acknowledgement of how heartbreaking and how sad and how hard this is. Um, and then committing, right, to like finding the most effective or the ways to be well in spite of that, right? But you can't do that without acknowledging, because otherwise it's just like, oh, I'm well, I'm on the wellness track. Wellness from what? Unless you understand what is not well, then how can you create a plan for wellness? And
Mhm.
so and I think the reason I keep doing the work is because I need to keep learning the lesson myself, right? Because, it's hard. And so giving others that space comes from first learning how to give myself that space and how to get healthier myself. And then maybe then I'll have a platform to actually stand on to say, here is what happened to me and here's my journey. I don't know if it works for you, but this was my experience and how I try to get well. And I more than anything, I just love for you to be well. And what that looks like in your life, I don't know, but here's some examples. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, simple, but really, it makes so much sense. Um, is there anything you want to plug? Anything you've like, I don't know, written or are writing? I don't know, nothing.
Uh, I mean, like my biggest thing is like devote time to your own wellness. And I
Mm,
think if we do that, if we all do that in a very serious endeavor, we will all make this experience better.
great. Well, I guess we'll end on that note. Thank you
All
so
right.
much.